Hello guys, welcome to the workshop. In today's video we're going to be doing some practical electrical wiring. We recently did an electrical wiring schematic video where we covered the whole of the off-grid 12 volt system for our camper van. I also gave away some free schematics with that video, so if you're interested in watching that first, I'll put a link up here to that video. In this video we're going to go through the tools that you'll need to do your electrics. We'll go through the various connection options, and we'll also do some practical soldering and actually connect some circuits together on the bench and have a look at how all that's connected together. So first of all, let's have a look at what tools we need. Okay, what I've got laid out on the bench here are a selection of the tools that I've been using for the electrical wiring. So let's quickly just go through what we've got here. So on the far left, this is just a normal Stanley knife with a nice sharp blade in it. We'll be using that for trimming the PVC. A good pair of side cutters, nice sharp pair for cutting the cable. And then we've got a couple of wire strippers. These are both automatic wire strippers. There's a cheap set and then a more professional set. A couple of sets of crimping tools. These just work like a normal set of pliers, and these ones actually work on a ratchet. So look, again, sort of low end of the market, more professional. We've got a huge set of heavy duty crimp tools for doing battery lugs on the really thick cables, your 10mm, 16mm, 35mm. So you need a tool like that to do those lugs. Good set of Electrician's insulated screwdrivers. I've got a 25 watt soldering iron, just a basic soldering iron. And then my little soldering station, somewhere to hold the soldering iron, a little stand with a wet sponge, some spare soldering tips, and one of these little helping hands. These really do come in handy when you're soldering. You always find you need an extra pair of hands. We've got some solder, some flux. I've got my heat gun and a selection of heat shrink. And then lastly, just a little multimeter just to do some testing. Okay, on the bench here I've got a selection of connectors. Now when you're connecting to battery terminals and blade fuse holders like this, they've usually got a stud connection or a screw connection. So you'll need a crimped fitting, either a ring crimped fitting like this. Some of these are larger ones for larger battery cables, or some of these like spade connectors. Again, it's a crimped fitting. You'd undo the screw and then this little spade connector would slide in underneath the screw. So these are the options for crimp fittings. You can get these lugs in various different sizes to suit different cable sizes, and they have different diameter holes. Some of these are obviously small holes like this, which are suitable for the blade fuse holder, and some of these larger circles up to sort of 10mm you would need for your battery connections. Then we go on to simple wire connections. They do these crimps, these are heat shrink ones actually, but they do straight connecting crimps as well. These are a new type of connector. I think it's pronounced Wago. I'll put the name up on the screen. But basically they've just like a little clamp in there. You pull these two little levers up, you stick your wires into those holes in the end, and then you close the levers down. And what it does, it just grips, there's like a little barbed tooth in there, and it just grips onto the end of the wire. And they're quite strong, these actually. These are a new thing out, but they're very expensive. That's the only downside to this. Really simple to install, but can be costly if you're using a lot of them. And we'll show you how they work in a minute. You've got the old-fashioned, what people call chocolate blocks, basically. These screw terminal connectors. They're a brass fitting inside with a screw in there, and then you put your cables in from either side, undo up the screws, and then that grips the cable both sides. And it's a real simple basic way of connecting wires together. If you look on the back here, it's very small writing, but this says it's 5 amp rated, and all of these connectors are different sizes depending on the amps rating that you're putting through them. So these little Wago connectors, for instance, these are actually rated to 32 amps, believe it or not. They're quite small, but they'll take quite a high current. As I say, these come in different sizes. This one's 5 amp, and they do go up. You do get much bigger one of these. Will take much bigger cables, and obviously will take a lot bigger amps rating as well. These are a fairly new thing. These are exactly the same as these, but rather than screw terminals, these have just got a simple push mechanism. It pushes down that little metal plate that you can see in there. You push it down, insert your wire, let go, and then it just grips onto the wire. So again, a really simple way of joining cables together. Very quick and easy, and we'll show you how they work as well in a minute. But by far my preferred method, if possible, would be to solder the wires with some solder, my little soldering iron, and then apply some heat shrink. Where you can do that, I think that's by far the best way of joining cables together. Let's first have a look at cutting and stripping the cable. I've got two different types of cable that I used in the van. This is the rubberized cable, which is just a 2-core 1.5, and this blue cable here is the Arctic blue cable. This is a 2.5 3-core that I use for my 230 volt mains. First thing you need is a decent set of side cutters. They need to be quite strong and they need to be sharp, so you can cleanly cut through your cables, and that gives you a nice clean finish. They need to be sharp, otherwise you will be struggling to cut some of these thicker cables, especially things like, you know, when you get up to your 16mm battery cable, like this here is a 16mm solid core cable. You know, you need a decent pair of side cutters to be able to cut through that and give you a nice clean cut. So that's the first thing you need. Then for stripping cable, the best thing I found is a standing knife. Now you do need to be careful with these, they're very dangerous. So just, you know, watch what you're doing. Now rightly or wrongly, this is the way I do it. I find I put the blade underneath the cable. I just apply a little bit of pressure on top with my thumb, just being careful, and then just roll the cable around very carefully. Don't go too deep because you don't want to cut through those cores. Just enough to go through the PVC sheathing, and then what I do then is I just bend it, and you'll see that break, and then that just pull off. And that's the easiest way to do the thicker cables. And the similar method applies for getting the outer sheathing off these flexible cables. So again, with the knife underneath the cable, a little bit of light pressure with your thumb on the top, and just twist the cable round gently. Just go all the way around, don't go too deep because you don't want to cut the inner cables, and then just bend. You'll see that insulation break. I haven't cut quite enough through there, so just give it a little nick. It's enough just to break through that insulation like that, and then that will come off. And that's the easiest way I find to get rid of that outer sheathing on both these small flexible cables and your heavy duty battery cables. Now be careful that you don't go too deep on this, because obviously if you go too deep, I'll exaggerate it. And what you'll find is, as well as taking that sheathing off, what you've also done, if you look closely here, is I've also cut through these inner cores. I've cut through that sheathing on the inner core. I don't know whether you can see that, but you can see some exposed wires there. So just be careful not to go too deep when you're trimming that outer insulation off. So we've stripped the outer sleeve. Now we want to strip these inner sleeves. There's a couple of options which are really simple to do that. There's these automatic wire strippers. This is a really basic cheap set, but they still work perfectly well. You insert your wire to the depth that you want to strip, and then as you close the pliers, it grips the cable, and then those inner teeth will pull that insulation off. Really nice and easy to use, very, very simple. and they're quite cheap, those. You can pick them up for a couple of quid, those. A more professional version, but does exactly the same job, is these. And again, you put your cable in the jaws there to the depth you want. There is also a little depth gauge here you can adjust, so you can do multiple cables to the same depth. Push the cable into the stop, and then as you squeeze, it grips the cable and strips it at the same time. These are brilliant. You know, if you're doing a lot of wiring, these things make the job so much easier. They're well worth their money, and they're not that expensive, to be fair. I'll put all the links in the description below. So there we go, we've got our cables outer sheath stripped, wires are bare. Now we want to look at connections. So let's make one of these little crimped fittings onto our cable to connect to our blade fuse holder. We only need a short amount of bare copper showing for these little crimps, because the metal part inside that insulation is only fairly tiny. So we just need a short piece of exposed copper. I'll twist these again like we did before, just to bring them all together, make them a bit more of a solid cable. Now blue is for 1.5 to 2.5. I open up the crimp, and then what I do is I just a couple of clicks on the ratchet just to hold on to it so it's not going to fall about, so it frees up my other hand. And then what that allows me to do then is to insert the cable from the back. Just make sure that it's not sticking right the way through, but I can just see the copper cores just coming through there, and then crimp right down all the way until the ratchet releases. And then now that's on there quite tight, and if you've got the right size cable in the right size crimp, that does make quite a solid connection. Sometimes if you try and crimp one of these onto a cable that's too small, they won't grip it enough and it just falls off. Let's just do another one of those. So put the crimp into the tool, a couple of bites down, a couple of clicks on the ratchet just to hold it so it's not going anywhere. Insert the cable from the back so I can just see the copper cores poking out the end there, and then ratchet right the way down until it releases. And there we go, that's a good solid connection on there. And then that's ready to be connected onto our blade fuse holder. Simply insert underneath the little washers there around that screw, and then tighten the screw. Alright, that's it. And then tighten the screw down. And there we go, a nice solid connection onto our blade fuse holder. And then the negative obviously would go around onto the negative bar. Same way. Put them underneath the washer. And then do that screw up. There we go. That's nice and tight. Yeah, quite simple. Let's say we want to join these two cables together. We've got a couple of options. We can use this electrical junction block. We can cut off a couple of these little blocks, undo the screws, and then simply insert our cable, tighten the screws back up, and that would be holding that nice and firm. You'd simply insert your other cable from the other side, do the screws up on that, and then that cable would be joined. That's one option. They can be reused. A development of those is these blocks. These don't have screws. You just simply push down on these little levers. It opens this opening here. You can push the cable in, and then when you let go, it grips on to the cable. Same the opposite side, push the cable in, let go, and it grips hold of it. Same with these positive ones, push the cable in, same with this side, and that's it. The joint is made as quick as that. And it's got these barb fittings, so the more you pull on that, the stronger it grips onto the cable. And then you simply wrap that with some insulating tape or put it into one of these junction boxes, and that would be then a sealed connection. These are reusable. You can just simply push on there, take your cable out, push on there, take the cable out, and they can be reused. So a very quick way of joining cables together. And then you have got these Wago blocks. They've got these little levers that you pull up. Works on a very similar principle, but these are rated for a much higher current. These will actually go up to 32 amps, these little connectors. Whereas this connector is only rated for 5 amps. They do different sizes. And this particular one would only be good for 5 amps. Once the levers are in the up position like that, then the block is open. These you have to join the same cable together, so effectively you push the negative in one side, push the other negative in the other side, close the little lever. Same with the two positives. Push the positive in one side, close the lever, push the other positive in the other side, close the lever. That's it. And those joints are done now. And again, they're very, very strong. The more you pull on those, the harder it grips onto it. A really simple, quick and easy way to make a joint. The only downside with these are they're a little bit expensive. They're probably one of the dearer connections. You can reuse them again, just flip up the little levers and you can take the joint apart. Much more expensive than these and a lot more expensive than these. But really quick, simple and easy to use. My preferred method is none of these. I like to solder my connections because I just think it's more permanent. So let's get the soldering station set up and we'll show you how to solder these wires together. Right, I've got my little soldering station set up here. Let's quickly run through what I've got. Got my 25 watt soldering iron in the stand, plugged in and heating up. I've got a little damp sponge here which we'll use to clean the end of the soldering iron. Just a little bit of water on it, not soaking wet, just damp. I've got my little helping hand here. It's always helpful to have that, just to hold the cables. We've got some flux just to clean the tip of the soldering iron if it gets dirty. I've got some resin core flux solder. That means the flux is actually in the core of this solder. This is the best one to get, really, to be honest. And then we've got our heat shrink here just to wrap the wires with. So I'm going to show you a couple of different methods of how to join the cables. If you're in a workshop environment like this, it's usually better to tin the wires first. So I normally twist the cables together like we have done before. And by tinning the wires, what I mean is applying a little bit of solder to the cable first. So we'll just put that in our little stand so we can got our hands free. Now the tip of the soldering iron needs to be clean. You can see there that the tip of that soldering iron is quite black. So I'll just tin the end of the soldering iron. So I'll put it in a little bit of flux. You can see the flux melting there. And then wipe that clean. I'll place a little bit of solder on the end of the iron and again wipe that clean. And then now you can see the tip of that soldering iron is a lot more shiny and clean. The oxidization has disappeared. And that's what you need. A clean soldering iron will work a lot better. Always make sure that your cable's clean as well, but if you've just freshly stripped it, that should be fine. And then the best way to do this, I find, is to put a small blob of solder onto the soldering iron, because that transfers the heat a lot quicker to the cable. So I've got a little blob of solder on the end of the soldering iron. I hold that underneath the wire, that transfers the heat, and then I can add additional solder to the top and just work my way down the cable. And there. That's completely tinned that wire. I do the same with the next one. Wipe the soldering iron in between. Keep that tip nice and clean. Let's just twist this one up. I'll tell you what, I'll do the negative on this wire and then we can do the two different options then. So we'll join these two negatives together. So again, I'll just put it in my little helping hand and you can just hold it for us. Again, clean the tip of the soldering iron, apply a little bit of solder on the end of the soldering iron, hold that underneath the wire and then add solder from the top. You can see that's wicking in there, and just move down, and it's as quick as that. You can see that's completely covered in solder now. Wipe the tip of the iron again on the sponge, which is nice and clean, you can see, and then put that back in the stand. Right, now both our wires are now tinned. This one here is covered in solder and the one that we did earlier is as well. So now we can put those two wires together side by side in our little helping hand. This is where it really does help to have these. We can just manipulate those so that they're side by side like that. Oh, one thing I nearly forgot there is to put the heat shrink on first. That is one thing that you will regularly do when you're soldering, is forget to put the heat shrink on. So put that on the wire first, because once they're soldered together, of course, you won't get it on there. Position the two wires so they're close together, and then we'll do the same process again, but now we're going to join the two together. Clean our soldering iron, give that a wipe, put a little bit of solder on the tip of the soldering iron again, just a little bead, because it transfers the heat really quick. And again, soldering iron from underneath, add solder from the top, and this won't take long. Just float a little bit of solder in there like that. Clean off the soldering iron again, put it back in the stand. Just let that cool for a few minutes. Not even that really, a couple of seconds. Let that cool down. And then that will be a nice solid connection. You see now those two wires are really well joined together. You know, there's a real good solid bead of solder there. And then the last thing to do is obviously just pull the heat shrink over those two, and with our little heat gun, get these wires out of the way, put our heat shrink over there, that's it, and with our little heat gun we'll just apply some heat. And there we go, that's our connection made, and that'll be really secure. You know, that'll much better, I think personally, than the other sort of what I consider to be like temporary sort of connections, but that's the best way to join the cables together. So that would be one way, tinning the wires first. Often when we're in the van, don't have the luxury of having these little helping hands, and you're stuck somewhere underneath the chassis or somewhere where it's difficult to hold these and solder at the same time. So in a lot of cases what I'd do then is I'd take these cables, I'd splay them out, fray these out like this, fan them out like that, and then I'd twist them together. and then simply clean the soldering iron again, and then I'd solder them both together at the same time. So a generous amount of solder, because we're soldering both these. This will put the heat straight into the wire, and we can run that solder straight in there. Move down, applying more solder, and there you go. Clean the iron. Just let that cool for a second. And there you go. Those two cables are really, really strong now, really solid. You know, that's a really good join. And then you just obviously heat shrink over the top. Again, I haven't put any heat shrink on this one, but you saw me do the other one. And that's the way I would normally do it in the van. I'd just twist the cables together and then solder them both together as quick as that. And as long as your cables are clean and your soldering iron's clean and you're using this flux cord solder, the joint will be really good. You know, that you won't get a dry joint. It will be really, really good, solid. And that's by far my preferred method for joining cables. So don't be put off by soldering. It is really straightforward. The equipment doesn't cost a lot. I think you can buy the full kit for about £30 for a basic setup. Just make sure everything's clean. Clean the soldering iron, a little bit of flux, and then just practice on the bench. Just tin in some wires on some scrap wire. Apply your little bit of solder onto your iron first. Get that little bubble of solder on the end of your iron. Place that underneath the wire. That'll transfer the heat really quickly, and then feed your fresh solder in from above, and then just continue down to the end like that. And it's really that quick and easy. The heat transfers to the wire fairly quickly through the solder, and then as you feed fresh solder in from the top, it just gets drawn into that cable. Now, I know quite a few of you who are used to doing your own electrics will think that tutorial is very basic, but I also know there's lots of people out there that follow the channel that have never done any electrics before, and I'm sure they'll find that information useful, or I hope so anyway. And if you'd like to have a go at soldering in your own van, I've got a nice little giveaway that I think will interest you. So here you go guys, if you're about to start the wiring in your van and would like to try some soldering, I've bought these tools that I think will come in useful for you. I've got a 25-watt soldering iron, the same as the one that I use. I've got a little pair of these helping hands. I've got the soldering iron stand with the sponge, a couple of rolls of that flux core solder, a set of crimping pliers, and I'm also going to give you a packet of those quick connectors and a packet of those Wago connectors. So it's a nice little set there for beginners soldering. That'll get you going in your van. All you have to do if you're interested in having this little kit is just leave me a comment below, share the video on social media, and make sure that you're subscribed. And then what I'll do is it'll be a completely random draw out of all the people that are interested, and I'll release the winner in the next video. So there we go, that's a nice little set there to get you going with your electrics in your van. I hope you enjoyed that video. I am planning to do another electrical video because I've had loads of questions from people wanting to know how to wire switches, whether it just be simple on off switches for lights, double pole isolation switches on your solar panel, or changeover switches for mains changeover. So we're going to cover switches and how to wire them in the next electrical video. Thanks very much for watching guys. Take care. Cheers.